Hello, this is Charles Pinkerton. I'm a Regional Extension Agent in Alabama, and we're excited to welcome you to our webinar today in the All Bugs, Good and Bad. And the webinar today is going to be on pesticide strategy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this is brought to you by E-Extension Communities of Practice of Imported Fire Ants, Urban IPM, Pesticide Environmental Stewardship, and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, and the University of Georgia Center for Urban Agriculture. We are excited to have with us our speaker today is Kaci Buhl, and Kaci is a senior faculty research assistant at Oregon State University in the Department for Environmental and Molecular Toxicology. She's the coordinator for the National Pesticide Information Center, and she's going to be talking a little bit more about her background as she does the presentation. Encourage you to, if you have questions, to respond in the chat box to your left of your screen. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Kaci. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. This is Kaci Buhl. As questions come in on the chat box, I think we're going to kind of batch them up and deal with most of them toward the end unless something really jumps out at me. But I do have a pretty full presentation today, so I want to make sure and move through it at a good pace to be respectful of everyone's time. And I'm so grateful for your time and attention today. Thank you for showing up. They asked me originally to talk about pesticide safety in just about an hour, and I thought, how in the world am I going to cover that kind of broad topic in just an hour? So I'm going to talk about strategies going from beginning to end as you approach your growing season in the garden and as you move forward into the fall. So that's the approach we'll be taking. Most of my experience and background actually comes from working at the National Pesticide Information Center. I've worked there for over 10 years as a frontline specialist and as a coordinator, and I've talked to over 10,000 people myself over that amount of time, and I feel like I've heard it all, and I'm going to share a lot of those stories with you today. For those of you who haven't met me, I wanted to show you a little bit, give you an idea of who's talking. This is me. And in this picture, I'm weaving together some rabbit fencing with some deer fencing, just to underline the point that IPM is definitely my background. My master's degree is in IPM with an entomology focus from Michigan State, but I've been working in the pesticide world for the most part since I graduated over 10 years ago. This presentation was built for people who might use pesticides in and around their homes, in particular with gardening, and the heroes who advise them, like extension agents and master gardeners. So I hope some of you are with us today. I want to start with just a few slides so you understand where a lot of my background comes from, because it comes from NPIC and what kind of questions we receive. And I'm also going to make the case throughout the presentation that I think extension agents and master gardeners can use our services and also hand out our phone number when it's relevant. So I want to make sure you know what we do. We answer questions about the health effects of pesticides, the environmental fate and properties of pesticides. We answer questions about labels and regulations, pests, and potential IPM strategies. Our mission is to be a source of science-based information for anyone who inquires. We have a toll-free phone line that's open 8 to noon, and that's on the West Coast. If you're on the East Coast, that's 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday through Friday. And we also respond to emails, voicemails, and social media inquiries within 1 day. Over time, at our maximum, we had up to 25,000 inquiries per year, and our webpage is getting over 5 million views per year, and that's real human eyeballs. If you count web hits, which sometimes can be computers coming in and hitting the server, that's 32 million. So it's very widely used, and we're proud of the website. I hope you have a chance to check it out at some point. Now, in closing, what do? We translate that technical information into plain language as best we can. If you're familiar with working with pesticides or labels, you know, sometimes it can be very difficult to interpret. We also recognize opportunities to prevent incidents. When we hear about exposure incidents, we document those in a database, and it's usable by EPA and also states when they do risk assessment, and also when they do product registration. They can ask us what kind of incidents have been reported for this product, and how can we maybe address that with different label statements. So it's kind of a surveillance program in addition to its role as an information program. We promote integrated pest management. I hope everyone on the line knows what that means, but you'll hear a lot about it in the presentation today. Legal use practices, and of course, label comprehension. There's some boundaries to bring up, what the things that we don't do. We can't diagnose anyone's symptoms. If someone calls and says, I think I have a headache because I was working with this pesticide, we can't confirm or deny. Of course, we're not healthcare providers. We also don't come up with straight up recommendations for pest control strategies or products or ingredients. We take the approach of laying out a suite of options so the caller can make up their own mind with the situation they have at hand. And of course, we can't do great big research projects if folks want us to do that for them. All right, now that you know a little bit about the National Pesticide Information Center and where all my interesting stories are coming from, let's talk about what we're going to go over today in this presentation. We'll talk about inspecting your inventory, planning your attack, selecting a pesticide, things to do before, during, and after the application that are good best practices. We'll spend some time on storage and disposal. We'll touch again on the kind of ways that NPIC can help you and the people you serve. And we'll finish up the presentation with some true stories of horror. We've heard more than a few at the center, and I'll share some of those with you today. All right, first let's clarify our terms. A lot of folks think that the word pesticide just means insecticide. And this is an entomology-focused crowd, but I'm sure many of you know that it's actually much broader than that, and that all of these things are considered pesticides under the law. And that includes things that repel, like repellents, pheromones that disrupt the mating of moths and other things, plant growth regulators. In this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides, as they're the most commonly used in the home garden. One of the foundational concepts about pesticides to begin with is that the label is the law. When you read your shampoo container and it tells you to reapply, you don't necessarily follow that direction because it's not required. But with pesticide products, it's a whole different ballgame. Every statement on that label is legally enforceable, and so it must be followed. You'll hear me repeat that throughout the presentation as well. All right, now it's February when we're giving this presentation, and it's a time of year that's so exciting. We're poring over seed catalogs, cleaning up our tomato cages, dreaming of the next growing season. Well, I argue it's already time to get busy on your pest control strategy and also your pesticide safety regimen. We're going to start with inspecting your inventory. First, don't separate pesticides from their labels if you possibly can. It's pretty frustrating that so many labels actually come in detachable pamphlets because it's very difficult to reattach them to the product package. But if you can use binder clips or rubber bands or staples, those kind of things to make sure they stay together, please do that. If you find things in your shed that look like this picture on the left and you can't tell at all what's in that bottle, you may have to treat it like household hazardous waste. And that we call that HHW around here. And we have a list for every state. There's a link there. If you go to that link and click on your state, then there's a link for household hazardous waste, and you can call that phone number. Typically what happens when you call that phone number is they tell you there might be a collection event coming up somewhere in your state in the next 3 months or sometimes 6 months. They're not held very often, but when they're held, they're typically free events. So you can load up all the stuff in your shed you're not sure about and take it down all at once. I'm going to mention this again in the presentation, but let's pay attention to this for just a moment. Putting a milky substance into a milk jug where it's separated from its label is so dangerous. I can't even explain how dangerous that is. If there were a fire or there were a flood and first responders had to come in, they wouldn't know what they were dealing with. They might even assume that it's actually milk. Someone actually might mistake this for milk and pour some and take a drink. So this is a practice to pretty much outlaw in any of your sheds, any of your clubs. This is not a practice that should be allowed. Okay, moving forward. As you're inspecting your inventory, make sure to discard any containers that are bulging or bowed. There can be big changes to the product in storage over time, especially if your storage area is subject to freezing or temperatures over 85 degrees. Usually on the pesticide product label in the storage section, it says to store it in a cool, dry place and don't subject it to extreme temperatures. Things can change dramatically. Now, when you're in doubt about whether or not something might still be good, if it's been in the shed for years and you can't even remember when you bought that, look for an expiration date. Most pesticide products don't have expiration dates on them, but you can call the manufacturer and ask about the shelf life. And they'll follow up by asking you about any extreme temperatures that it has been exposed to. We also have a list of manufacturers because they don't always put their phone numbers on the label. So we maintain a list of 300 or 400 pesticide manufacturers and their toll-free numbers on our website. Next, as you're going through your shed to inspect your PPE, your personal protective equipment. Dry conditions over the winter can actually make things brittle and cause them to crack. So even if they were perfectly functioning pieces of PPE last fall, they need to be inspected upon the springtime. Pay special attention to the seams. I've heard stories over time where people say, I was using my gloves and I knew it was wet inside my gloves, but I thought it was sweat. Until, a couple hours into my project, I finally took my gloves off to go have lunch, and I have red rash skin only on one hand. Well, that one hand had a hole in the glove that they weren't aware of. So pay special attention and look for holes. They can crop up on you before you realize it. If you do ever have to use a respirator, there's often a cartridge that has to be replaced at least once a year. So it's a good time right now to go look at it, see what the serial number is on it, and order your new cartridge. All right, now that we've inspected everything, it's time to sit down with a clipboard and plan your attack. First, make a list of all your biggest pest problems last year. And as you make your list, you might think about things that were actually problematic, things that you noticed but they weren't problematic, and ask yourself how much of those pests can be tolerated. Did it really impact your harvest so much that it would require spraying or some kind of intervention this year? If it's an ornamental plant, did it impact your enjoyment of the garden so much that it justifies buying a whole product or taking additional steps? As you make that list, also, you might be listing plants that have been a problem for you every year since you've had that rose bush. And I put up a picture of roses with black spot because if you've got a rose bush that is susceptible to black spot, you've probably been dealing with it forever. And if you can tolerate the idea of replacing that rose bush with one that might be more resistant to black spot, it would reduce the pest pressure very much. So ask yourself those tough questions as you're planning your attack. Next, when you're thinking about last year's biggest pests, can you get out ahead of them with barriers or exclusion? This is a barrier that's popular out in the Northwest for cucumber beetles, especially when plants are young and just seedlings and they're still that bright, fresh green, and they're so very susceptible and so very delicious to beetles. If you can keep them covered up long enough where they're starting to put on some dark green growth and they're getting more vigorous, then they can actually withstand more insect pressure than they can when they're very, very young. So there might be creative ideas you can think of for the major pests that you dealt with last year. Next, read up. There are so many excellent resources out there from Extension, from Master Gardeners, and many of those resources are specific to your state. You can even go and find a specific fact sheet about the pest you've been dealing with in your state. And that's so highly valuable. Someone wrote that who's already been dealing with the problem, and they might know key issues of timing and other things to be aware of. If you can plan ahead and you know the vulnerable life stage you're looking for, you might be able to head this off at the pass. I put up a picture of scales because they do actually have a very susceptible life stage, and it's the very young runners. And when they hatch out and they're moving to another spot on the branch where they're going to make their permanent home, they're very susceptible to pesticide application, but also to a stiff stream of water that just knocks them off the twig where they may not make it back to a position that will help them survive. I put a picture up of slugs as well. If you struggled with slugs in your vegetables last year, once they get up into the canopy of your vegetable plants, you kind of lost the battle in terms of using baits if you think you want to use baits. There's no reason for them to come down the plant and enjoy those baits on the ground when they're already in hog heaven up in the canopy of your vegetables. So that's one that you can get out ahead of. And if you do want to use baits for slugs and snails, I encourage you to think about putting them under a board so that any pets or wildlife in the area can't have ready access to it. And it actually makes a nice trap for slugs and snails because they look for shelter as well. All right, now as you're planning your garden, think about maximizing the airflow. That will reduce your disease pressure over time. And when you're first planting, it looks very nice and open, but remember how very dense it can get when you get down to August and September. Many diseases are driven by the hours of leaf wetness. Literally, how many hours are the leaves wet? So if you plan your garden in such a fashion to help the dew dry as fast as it can, you'll lower your disease pressure. One thing that folks have told me is helpful is to orient your rows along with the prevailing wind in your area. So the wind will gently blow through the rows instead of being perpendicular to the rows. So that's one idea. All right, moving to the next section of our presentation today, selecting pesticides. First, the label must absolutely have the site of application listed. And when I say the site, if we're talking about vegetables, it has to have the specific type of vegetable plant listed. If you want to use it on tomatoes, it has to say tomatoes. If you want to use it on ornamental plants, sometimes it'll just be really broad and it might say all ornamentals, but often it's more specific and actually lists out the types of annuals and perennials that can be treated with that specific product. If it can only be used indoors, it's not meant for your garden, etc. Now with the pest, the label might actually list the pest that you're looking for. And if it does, you can be assured that the manufacturer has done some kind of testing at some point and it was effective at killing that pest. But we know that pesticide resistance can develop over time, so it's no guarantee. And it's prohibitive for them to test their pesticide product on every pest that might be possible. We know there's, thousands of different insect species, so it's not required. But there is one exception to that. If you're dealing with a vertebrate pest, a rodent, a mole, a gopher, you have to find a very specific species on the product label in order to use that product for that pest. That's just for rodents and rodenticides. Now, when you're looking at the label, also check for PPE. If you don't want to buy a chemical-resistant apron, then don't buy a product that requires you to wear one. So that's why it's important to read the whole label while you're standing in the store before you bring it home. And just to clarify something that a lot of folks have asked me over time, am I allowed to open up that label and peel back the hidden part of the label before I buy the product? The answer is yes, absolutely. And it would be irresponsible not to, because you really need to read that label before you decide to bring it home. So feel free. And usually they stick right back on. And if they don't, well, that was poor design, but it's not your fault. You still have to read the label. Another thing to consider as you're looking at the label is the signal word, which can be a key to telling you how toxic the product is as formulated in the bottle. If the signal word is caution, that means it's low in toxicity. Warning means moderate. Danger means high. We have a lot more specifics on our website about how these are derived. There are some rare products out there that don't have a signal word at all, and typically that's because they're so low in toxicity they're exempt from most of the product registration requirements. But typically you'll find one of these three words in all caps, and that's the way it applies to the product in the container as a whole, not just the active ingredient, but as a whole, including the solvents and everything else. All right, moving forward. Another thing to consider is pest specificity. Some examples of pest-specific products that I can share with you. Bacillus thuringiensis, if you get the variety Kristaki, it only kills caterpillars that eat it. So that's very specific, and it would spare any ladybird beetles or lacewings or other beneficial organisms that are not in that family, the Lepidoptera. Insecticidal soap is a little pest-specific in a different way. It works best to kill soft-bodied insects like aphids and whiteflies, whereas ground beetles or ladybird beetles would be more resistant to this type of product. Now, why do we want to think about pest specificity? Let's do a thought experiment. These leaves don't necessarily reflect just leaves. It might be a whole plant, and it might be your whole garden. So looking at the leaf all the way to the left, you have enough purple pests that you're concerned about it, and you decide to go ahead and spray a broad-spectrum insecticide. You've had predators that were present as well, mowing down on all those purple pests. The surviving predators after a broad-spectrum insecticide often starve because they don't have enough pests to keep them fed sufficiently for that population to grow. So predators are very often hit harder than the pests are by a broad-spectrum insecticide for that reason. And when you picture what happens next, pests have all the food they want. I mean, they've got all this plant material, so they start to rebound very quickly. Predators don't have everything they need because there's not an adequate pest population right away, so they lag behind. So often they describe this as pest resurgence. The pest numbers can be higher than they were before the pesticide application. So then you can find yourself in a position where you have to spray again when the resurgence happens, and possibly spray again, and maybe get on one of those unfortunate treadmills where you feel like you have no choice but to spray again and again. This can actually look different. Sometimes, let's do a different version of this thought experiment. We know that it's more complicated than that. Usually there's more than one pest in the garden and more than one predator. So let's imagine in this case that the red pest was pretty well under control until you killed its predators. And what you sprayed for in the first place was the purple pest, because that's the really numerous one in your garden. But you knocked out the predators, the orange predators that were eating the red pest. The red pest might multiply faster and fill up that niche that was left by the purple pest. So sometimes you can have a pest resurgence that happens with a whole different pest. An example that happens a lot in the literature is that you might spray for aphids, but you have a resurgence with mites, because this is a complicated system. And when you use a broad spectrum insecticide, it's really knocking out everything that gets sprayed and not just the pest species. So which insecticides are broad spectrum? Things like, well, most of them are, essentially. The carbamates, like carbaryl, methomyl, the pyrethroids that are very popular for use in and around the home, they're broad spectrum. Neonicotinoids, which are becoming more popular for systemic pest insecticides in the garden, those are very broad spectrum and particularly toxic to bees. And other insecticides like fipronil, pyrethrins, chlorfenapyr, some other ones. If you're not sure, you can always read the label and see if there's a big long list of insects that's killed by these by the product. And if it's still uncertain, you can always give us a call, and there's our 800 number again. Now let's come back and think about this thought experiment one more time. The first one, you have all these purple pests and you decide to spray your broad spectrum insecticide. You're essentially saying to the predators, you're fired. I know you're not going to make it back to a population level that's helpful to me and my garden to keep the purple pests under control. So you know what? I'm going to take it from here. Essentially, you're taking over their role. So you might be in a position to have to spray again and again as the pest populations boom without having predator pressure. So if you do find yourself in the position to spray again and again, we have to talk about pesticide resistance. So in pesticide resistance, you can think of it as just part of the genetic diversity of the pest population, the purple pest population. Some of them may just be naturally resistant because there is diversity in that population. So the resistant ones are represented by the red pests in this slide. So if you hit the population repeatedly with the same pesticide, it removes the susceptible individuals, allowing the resistant few to dominate. And over time, the population becomes overwhelmingly resistant to the pesticide that you've been applying. I'm sure many of you listening to this can relate to some of the ideas here that maybe a pesticide worked well early in the season, but further into the season, it didn't seem to do much at all. And this is what could have been happening. So how do you address pesticide resistance? First, if a pesticide product failed to work in the past, we need to look it up and do some research because it's possible you have resistance. These are 3 posters, one for insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, that put active ingredients into mode of action groups. So once you find the active ingredient for the product that has failed you, you can look in that group and you'll see other active ingredients that will be just as useless to you as the one that you have in your hands. Don't bother trying another product in the same group. Consider combination products that have active ingredients from more than one mode of action group. And if you need help, always you can call NPIC for help deciphering this stuff. I want to show you an example of this insecticide poster. And please don't be intimidated by we can just ignore the molecular structures and focus in on the active ingredients, the names. Now I'm going to use a little pointer here to help me out. So, for example, if you were using malathion to address a problem, or chlorpyrifos or acephate, which was a very popular systemic in the past, and it stopped working, then you might as well not try carbaryl or methomyl or anything else in group 1, because resistance would be, it's called cross-resistance or co-resistance, and it would work because they both work on the same mode of action. Another example that often blows people's minds, if you've been working with pyrethroids, and many of us do, permethrin is the active ingredient we get most questions about here at our center. If you're finding resistance to permethrin in your garden, those same bugs would be resistant to DDT because they both act on the same part of the nervous system, the sodium channels along the trunk of the axon in the nervous system. So one of the things that I hear often when people call about bed bugs, they're desperate, they've tried a lot of things, including pyrethroids, nothing is working, I just need to get myself some DDT. And it's tough when I tell them, actually, if they're resistant to pyrethroids, they will also be resistant to DDT. They're in that same class. So I hope that demonstrates the idea of picking something in a different mode of action class. All right, moving on, more to think about with pest specificity. Let's talk about herbicides for a moment. Some kill broadleaf plants, and they're tolerated by grassy species. Others kill grassy species, and they're tolerated by broadleaf plants. The non-selective weed killers don't care. They're just going to kill plant tissue on contact. And those are some examples of the non-selective weed killers provided right there. So my shortcut for how to determine grassy versus broadleaf is to look at the veins of the leaves. If they're netted, most often you can assume that means broadleaf, and if they're parallel, you can assume that means grassy. There's, of course, some other things to tell monocots from dicots, but this is my quick shortcut for folks. All right, picking the right weed killer, even more to think about. A pre-plant weed killer is something that often they use to burn down an area and kill everything that's there, but that you want to be able to plant into that soil very soon afterwards. So it has to be some kind of herbicide that won't be active on the sensitive little seeds that come afterwards. A pre-emergent herbicide makes a barrier on the top of the soil. It makes a blanket through which it's very difficult for germinating seedlings to burst. When their tissue comes in contact with that barrier, the tissue is so sensitive and light green and barely, making it already that it doesn't make it through that penetration phase. But even once we have a plant that's at this stage right here, it's not a pre-emergent won't work on it because it's already penetrated through that blanket. Then you'd be thinking about something for post-emergence. And there's some examples provided there. An established stand is even harder to kill, so you'd be looking for different active ingredients in that respect as well. And I should clarify that any mention of these active ingredients or products specifically is not meant to be a recommendation or an endorsement. I'm just throwing out examples to help illustrate the points. Now, as you're selecting pesticides, another thing to consider, should I dilute the product? Should I buy a concentrate or buy one that's ready to use? Well, if you buy a concentrate, there's quite a commitment that you're making. You might have to have a backpack sprayer, a B&G sprayer. They call them a lot of different things, but you would probably want to consider keeping one sprayer for herbicides or weed killers and a whole separate one for insecticides. Plants are so very sensitive to herbicides and weed killers that even just the residue after you rinse out the sprayer can be enough to damage plants when you come back later and try to apply an insecticide with the same sprayer. You might want to consider keeping dedicated measuring spoons and cups and marking them pesticides only, so no one takes them back into the kitchen and tries to use them for food. There is always necessary equipment maintenance with these kind of devices, so you make sure to keep the manufacturer's instructions and follow those instructions for annual maintenance and cleaning, and plan ahead to avoid dealing with leftover diluted pesticide. We'll talk more about this in a bit, but trust me when I say it's a pain to deal with leftover diluted pesticide if you don't have a registered use site to spray it out on. Now, if you're buying ready to use, well, you know you're going to be buying some water with your pesticide, and it can be considered more expensive, but in some ways, it's also kind of the easy button. Also, another thing to think about when you're selecting pesticides, how much do you need? Buy only what you need this season. Many baits are formulated with food items, so they actually spoil. They have things like peanut butter or molasses in them that can go rancid if they're stored too long. So don't take the approach that you're going to buy enough for the next 5 years. Try to only buy what you need this season. You can avoid the uncertainty about shelf life that we talked about earlier and the rigmarole of handling disposal. And it also reduces the risk to the environment in case of a disaster. Remember also we talked about fires and floods before. If you have a big inventory in your shed and there's a flood, a lot of that inventory is going to end up in the water that people need to walk through to find safe havens. And the same is true of fires. When you have a fire, it gets a lot of water sprayed on it. And then that water might be contaminated with your big inventory of pesticides. I put a picture of this particular product up as a reminder to read the label before you leave the store, because I got caught on this one not too long ago. It looks like a shaker can that you would just kind of, shake out from the container. But actually, when I got home and read the label, it only takes about a tablespoon of this stuff for a whole treatment for the size garden beds that I was dealing with. And then I thought, man, it's going to take me 10 years or more to use up this big container of pesticides. So make sure to read the label and estimate how much you're going to need this season. Try to buy a smaller container if there is one available. All right. So are you in love with your label yet? There's so much good information on the label that you need to read before buying. A couple more things. Just to repeat, the site of application must be on the label. Consider the pre-harvest interval. Sometimes it's listed as a PHI, and a lot of people don't know what that means, but it means the time between the last application and the time you can harvest any fruits or vegetables that are grown on that plant. It can be very frustrating to use a product and then you want to harvest the next couple of days, but there's a pre-harvest interval of 2 weeks and you have to watch your fruit as it starts to go to the flies, waiting for that PHI to be expired. Read the environmental hazard statements. You'll find out if something is highly toxic to bees or fish or birds, and there'll be important statements there to consider, because you know when you're standing in the store where you want to use it, and you can see if this is an appropriate product for that location. Also read the precautionary statements. I know I might be beating a dead horse, but honestly now, have you read the instructions? You must read the entire product label. All right. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention the great resources available in just about every state. Ask a master gardener. They probably deal with the same pests that you have been dealing with because they're in the same state, right there with you, sometimes in the same county. They might know key elements of timing that make it work in your area, or nifty tricks that can help you avoid using pesticides at all. So to connect with your state's Master Gardener program, we have a list, and our list contains the contact information for the coordinator of Master Gardeners in each state. It's a place to start, but you can also just go Googling and look for Master Gardeners in your state or county. Now, we're getting closer to the point where we've planned our strategy, we've been thinking it through, we've selected a pesticide, and now we're getting ready to actually apply. Let's do some planning first. Put this number in your cell phone or near your phone. It's easy to remember. It's 3 2s, a 1, and 3 2s. So it's symmetrical on either side of that 1. 1-800-222-1222. Secure access to water, and what I mean by that is just pull the hose over to the area where you're going to be mixing and loading. I've spoken to folks on the phone who said, I was mixing and loading, I accidentally touched my eyes, and of course I touched both of them at the same time because I was wiping across my forehead, and then I had to stumble around the yard looking for the hose and I couldn't open my eyes. So bring that over and secure access before you start mixing and loading. Make sure you pick a spot that's well ventilated for your mixing and loading area, and keep a bag of kitty litter in the storage area. And the reason I bring this up, I've spoken to lots of folks who accidentally spilled a concentrate or some other kind of pesticide product on the patio or the garage floor, and it soaked in so quickly and it stunk for so long. And they'll call asking, is there anything I can do to neutralize that smell? And unfortunately, the answer is no many of the time. So if you had kitty litter handy, you can dump it on that spill really quick and keep it from absorbing into those materials. The day before you're ready to spray, if you don't know how many gallons you're going to need from prior experience, spray the target area just as you would the next day, but use plain water to see how many gallons you're going to need. That'll help you avoid the problem of leftover diluted pesticide if you are diluting. All right, now we're ready. Survey the scene. Take a look at the area around your garden or your yard where you're planning to make the application. Identify the air intake for the home. A lot of times it's on an air conditioner, especially in the summer. There's a big air intake spot. You can just turn that off for the duration of the application. Close windows and doors. Think about pet bowls, toys, bird baths, anything that people or animals might put their mouths on later as a good idea to cover or remove. Be aware of the water table and the soil type. If you're a gardener in this area, you probably know how deep you have to dig to find water and whether your soils are sandy. That's important to remember because some pesticides can be a groundwater risk. And that'll be in the environmental hazards section of your label to keep in mind. Avoid spraying near storm drains or riparian areas. A riparian area is an area that's really right up against a water body. It could be along a stream, a ditch, or a pond, but it's the area that slopes down to meet that water. And if you can avoid applications in those areas, it's generally best for water quality if you do. All right, we're ready. We're ready to get suited up. The minimum the personal protective equipment that you need is long pants, long sleeves, shoes, and socks. So at no point is it a good idea to apply pesticides wearing a tank top, shorts, or flip-flops. It's just unnecessary exposure. If you do use gloves, don't use the ones that you might be using for your other types of gardening if they're leather or fabric, because they might be absorptive. And it's kind of a worst-case scenario. If they get pesticide on them, they're holding that pesticide against your skin and giving it maximum possibility of soaking in. If you're going to be walking on the treated area as you go, consider wearing some dedicated shoes that won't be used in the house again. That residue, of course, can be transferred to the shoes. And in this picture, the guy's wearing rubber boots. That's particularly a good idea because leather boots are particularly notorious for absorbing, especially organic contaminants around walking on the treated area. All right, now you're getting ready. You're mixing, you're loading. Please make sure that kids and pets cannot access the area when you're mixing, loading, or applying. Not that you just don't think they'll access, or you're going to keep an eye on the area, but that they cannot. You close the gate, you've tied up the dog on the other side of the house. That's what I'm getting at. Because I've spoken to way too many people who were doing the mixing and loading outside, and the phone rings. So they run inside and answer the phone, and when they come back, something horrendous has happened. Maybe the dog knocked over a bottle of concentrate on the patio, or maybe they're eating all the bait that you were just getting ready to apply. So don't let this happen to you. Make sure things are nice and locked down tight before you're ready to do your mixing and loading. Now, as you get ready to do the mixing and loading, read the label carefully again. Remember that dry ounces are not the same thing as fluid ounces. If you're measuring dry ounces, you need to use a scale to weigh the material. If you're using a fluid, then you would use a measuring cup. Some products actually come with their own measuring cups, and that's because they've actually figured out how dense the product is, so they have done the conversion for you from weight to volume. And that measuring cup can then never be used for anything but that specific product because it's really dialed into that density. So make sure you're paying attention to those facets when you measure, and use the rate that's specified on the label. If you use more, it's illegal, and it could hurt your plants. If you use less, it may not be effective unless you've had that experience in the past, but having to come back and do it again is more exposure potential, and it could behave differently when applied at 2 different times.
Kaci,
all right. This picture comes from the medicine world or pharmaceuticals, but it's a very similar concept with pesticides. There may be a narrow window between the effective dose or the therapeutic dose and the toxic dose. So as you're mixing and trying very hard to make sure you get the rate just as it's described on the label, you really might be aiming for a very narrow window. So I'm making the argument that you need to be really careful and get that rate just right. All right, we're ready. It's time to spray. Now, avoid applications to hard surfaces. If you're near a sidewalk or near the side of the building and that's not your application site, be careful not to spray those hard surfaces because I can very easily run off of those surfaces, and it will also much faster evaporate off of those surfaces. So if you're dealing with volatile herbicides, they'll volatilize off those hot surfaces faster and potentially damage plants nearby. Pesticides can easily run off. Position yourself upwind whenever possible. I've also spoken to way too many people who got ready, did everything right. They're wearing all the, and the wind just blows the material. Burning nose, burning eyes, and that's no fun. So pay attention to the wind before you get started. And this slide speaks for itself. Just don't, okay? Just don't do this. If the pesticide is falling down on your hat, that's a bad idea. Don't do this ever. All right, now after the application, right afterwards, wash your gloves. before taking them off. If you wash them first, you can hang them up. They're ready to dry, and they're ready for you to handle the next time. Keep footwear with residue outside. Put clothing in a separate basket away from other laundry. Take a shower. Now, while you're in the shower, you'll be thinking to yourself very hard, now you're sure that kids and pets can't access. You're sure that kids and pets can't access the treated area, right? I've just been told that the volume might have dropped off, so let me see if I can do anything about that. I can move my mouthpiece a little closer. I hope that helps.
Hey, Kaci, it might be...
Can someone say in the chat box if that is helping?
Kaci, if it doesn't help, it might...
Are you able to hear me a little bit better? Not greatly. I'm not sure what else I can do to change the situation. I'll keep charging ahead, and hopefully those of you listening on your computers might be able to turn it up on your local speakers.
Hey, Kaci.
All right, I've moved that just as close as I can, and I will also speak up. All right, now, after we've gone through all those precautions and things that you should be aware of, you might be thinking, this doesn't apply to me because I only use organic products. Well, they are still pesticides. Essential oils can cause allergic reactions, burning eyes, and respiratory irritation. They can also be really hard on application equipment, so it's still important to pay attention to how you're storing those. More applications might be required for some of the organic products, which can lead to higher exposures over time, especially if you're not wearing PPE and applying those weekly or more. Even organic pesticides can be toxic to fish or bees or your plants at higher temperatures, and very often there are unknowns. All right, I'm going to try something else. They're saying using my phone without my headset, so I'll switch to that just a second. All right, can you folks hear me now?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, good. I'm going to continue at this point. I'm sorry for that disruption. I had to hang up and dial back into the phone number. All right, now that you've made the application, some information about what to expect. If you've applied a protective fungicide, it's only going to work on the plant surfaces that were sprayed today. If you have new growth coming on, and you know how fast that can happen, especially with zucchini and plants like that, that new growth will be unprotected. If you're using herbicides, it can take time to kill plants, sometimes up to 2 weeks. So make sure to read your label, and if you're still not sure, you can always call NPIC. I've spoken to too many people on the phones over time that will use a weed killer, and if those weeds aren't dead the next day, they try spraying again and again, and that's just unnecessary exposure to the environment and to you. Also, some insecticides may be slow to work. You may not see dead bugs right away. Now, what to do with leftover solution? Use it up on an approved application site. That's really the best and the only piece of advice I can give you. If it's a product that you mixed up to apply to turf or grassy areas, and you've already treated your grassy area, then ask around to see if your friends need the same kind of application, and you can go over and spray out the rest of what you've got on their grassy areas. Never pour pesticides onto soil, gravel, or turf. Never put pesticides in storm drains or street gutters. Usually there's a good section on the label that called disposal, and it'll tell you what to do with products, and oftentimes it's more focused on the product container. It tells you how to dispose of the empty container, but sometimes it will also tell you what to do with diluted product that you have left over. If you decide to store it and just put that sprayer back in the shed and maybe bring it out in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, the quality of that product may change in unexpected ways. It may get stronger, it may get weaker. So it becomes very imprecise and difficult. If you need to find a household hazardous waste event, we talked about that earlier, and there's a spot on our website where you can look that number up in your state. But this is another alternative. You can call Earth 911, and they try to keep track as well of the events that are going on around the nation. All right, now you're ready to put things away. Some good practices in pesticide storage. Don't store pesticides with food, near a well, or with your PPE. Try to put your liquids down low and your solids up high. So if you have granules and dust, they're up above the liquids. And that's, of course, because the liquids may leak over time, and then they're drizzling onto the pesticides below, making mixtures that are hard to predict. Secondary containment for liquids. This is a picture that does a great job demonstrating that. The secondary containment is the tubs underneath those jugs. So if one of the jugs actually got a crack in it, or maybe it failed for some reason, the dripping fluid or sometimes the gushing fluid would be caught by that secondary tray. All right, now that we've been through a great list of things to do, good strategies and bad, try to think again back to your beginning planning stage and think about how you can make the need for pesticides more rare. Instead of growing that problem fruit or vegetable, you could always buy them. I made that decision about zucchini this year. I could not keep up with the powdery mildew I was having to spray over and over again. And you know what? Zucchini is cheap, especially in this part of the country, so I'm just going to go ahead and buy it next year. Revisit those barrier ideas that might have seemed like too much work at the time, but maybe in the comparison to what the alternatives, they're better ideas now. Consider using mulch for weed suppression, or a hard stream of water to knock insects off your plants. Traps can be used to suppress pest populations, and again, replace any problem plants that are just problematic year after year with pest or disease-resistant varieties. Your ideal condition, when you look at your garden, you don't want to have zero pests. If you have zero pests, you'll have zero predators, because they have to have some pests to eat. So if you want to have a nice, healthy balance and keep things in check, you're hoping to have a few pests, some predators, and also pollinators and parasitoids that make your garden home. Flowering plants can attract those kind of things, and if you have a refuge of flowering plants that are purely ornamental and you really just don't need to spray them at all, that can be a refuge for a population. So that's just to plant the seed of an idea of what you're going for, is good diversity. All right, one more pitch to have you call the National Pesticide Information Center. You can call us to compare the toxicity of products, to evaluate their persistence. If you're not sure about some of the characteristics we talked about today, I'm not sure if the product in my shed is selective or if it might be out of date, you can call us about that. If you're wondering about a product's risk to groundwater, fish, or bees, or drinking water, or you just need help with some confusing label statements, we can help you with that. I am very proud of the team that we have here at NPIC. Folks sometimes think, since we're located at a university, that we have students answering the phone, and it's absolutely not true. These are professionals who love science and love people, and that's a great combination. It's hard to find in today's world, so do give us a call. All right, now we're going to finish up the presentation with talking about some ugly examples. Some of the worst stories I've heard over time. Do not assume that vegetable spray means all vegetables. I've actually seen labels that say on the front, vegetable spray, but if you open up the pamphlet on the back, they're only allowed for 1 or 2 vegetables. And the same is true with fruit tree spray. You have to go further. Don't assume that the last person who used the sprayer rinsed it out really well. Don't assume that your plants will be hardy enough to take small amounts of herbicide. They can be damaged easily, especially grapes, tomatoes, potatoes, things in the Solanaceae. And also, please don't assume that you don't need to wash up because you didn't get any on you. I've spoken to folks over time who say, you know, I didn't think I got any of that product on me. I didn't shower that night, and the next morning I woke up with the exposed area of my skin, everywhere that wasn't covered with a t-shirt, is red and inflamed. So there might be residue sitting on your skin that you are not aware of. And also, please don't apply the wrong product altogether. Every summer, we hear from people who accidentally sprayed their prize roses with herbicide, and they're just beside themselves about how to counteract the situation, and sometimes it cannot be counteracted. We also hear from people every year that accidentally used a product meant for ornamentals on their vegetable garden, and sometimes their entire vegetable garden. And then they're in the awful position of having to decide, do I have to discard all my fruits and vegetables because they have this illegal pesticide on them, or am I going to take a chance? If I take a chance for me and my family, am I still willing to share these with my neighbors like I normally would? And it's just heart-wrenching. So please be careful and avoid that. Also, some things to be aware of. Treated wood is treated with pesticides. That's what treated means. And some of them are more risky than others. In particular, railroad ties should not be used in gardening because creosote, or pentachlorophenol, can be carcinogenic, and they can sometimes, in small amounts, be taken up by plants. Now, if you already have a garden bed like this, there are things you can do. You can put in liners of landscape fabric to keep the roots and the railroad ties separate. All right, next, mothballs. They're gaseous pesticides, and they're only allowed to be used in airtight containers for that reason. They fill up the container with insecticide gas, and when they reach a toxic enough concentration, it kills the clothes moths that might be in that container. We've heard from hundreds of gardeners who try to use mothballs to deter cats, dogs from scratching around in their garden, snakes, all kinds of things, and the risk is not worth it. For one thing, it's illegal, and for another thing, it's available to pets, wildlife, and children. If a child picks up a mothball and puts it in their mouth, it's a trip to the emergency room, and it's just not worth that risk to be having them strewn about around your yard or around your garden. Pool chemicals are often pesticides. We hear from people every year who go to put one of the tablets in the pool and they put their face too close to it and get a big whiff of chlorine gas, which burns. It burns in the lungs, so make sure your face is away from that when you put them in. With foggers, I'm not sure where to start. There's so many ways foggers can go wrong. First of all, don't use too many. Hang a sign on your door. The reason to hang a sign on your door that says insecticide is that many times this has happened where a neighbor calls and says, I think there's a fire in my neighbor's apartment or in my neighbor's house. The fire department comes and they see what looks like smoke inside, and they charge in and they get a big face full of insecticide. And also, of course, follow the label. Turn off your ignition sources so something like this doesn't happen to you. A woman set off 24 bug bombs at once, causing an explosion that partially collapsed a Manhattan building. This one happened in 2003, but as long as I've been doing this work for 10 years or more, it seems like we hear one of these stories just about every year and sometimes more. So that's a serious precaution on the label. It's not being alarmist. Also, some of the ugly things that we've heard about people treating for bed bugs. I think bed bugs in particular, they affect the way people sleep and maybe affect their good judgment, because we've heard about people using heavy-duty pesticides, applying it to their own skin, sometimes applying it to the skin of their children, and we're talking about daily. Long-canceled pesticides being used in homes. For example, Aldrin, an organochlorine that we haven't used since the 70s, I believe. Piling on, where they apply pesticides over and over again at too high rates. We've heard about people using flammable liquids like gasoline to kill bed bugs, and this is, of course, in their bedrooms. We've heard about folks spraying their sleeping areas until wet with pesticide and doing that every night before bed. And we've heard of at least one human death that was related to pesticide misuse for bed bug control. So this is serious business. Those of you that are on the call today, if you do get calls from people about bed bugs, one of the early things you should bring up is that the label is the law, and you can make the problem worse and put yourself in more danger if you do misuse pesticides. Now, my brother is afraid of insects, and he often says, kill it with fire. Well, here are some great examples of why that's a horrible idea. As much as you might be afraid of the bugs or the spiders or whatever it might be, snakes in the bottom example, it's not worth burning your house down, of course. And lastly, the most ugly example. I started with this example, and I'm going to finish it with it. The ugliest thing you can do is put pesticides in a container that could be confused for food or beverages. In Poison Center data, over 1,400 times from 98 to 2009, they heard about poisonings caused by this practice, and at least 12 deaths were related to pesticides in that time. We talked earlier about how tempting it can be if you get a pesticide product and you have more than you can ever use. that you might want to share some with your neighbors. Well, I'm going to tell you today, take the pesticide product over to your neighbor in its container, in its original container with its label, and then go pick it up when they're done using it. The risk to life and limb from putting it in a container like this is just not worth it, so please don't do that ever. All right, now that we've talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, let's have some time for questions.
Okay, y'all feel free to type in your questions in the chat box. I also like to express appreciation. Several people have been helping us with the chat box. It's Danielle Carroll, and Danny's been working with me on moderating this, and Kathy Flanders, and then Amanda. I'm not sure I know how to pronounce Amanda's last name, but it's Tedro, and we appreciate her help. Again, there's Kaci's contact information on the screen, and I'm going to flip over to the next one. We have a short survey that we'd like you to complete. There's one that it may be in the chat box, but there's also this one that you see here. It's a URL that you can click on and then go in and answer some questions. And we need input to be able to continue these programs in order to provide information that is of interest to people and of benefit to them. And we appreciate you, Kaci. You did a tremendous job. You covered a lot of information in a short period of time. So.
Well, good. I'm glad. And I'm so sorry for the audio problems. I hope it wasn't going on too long.
Oh, no. Oh, it was fine. We hated to interrupt you.
That's all right.
Charles and Danny, I see quite a few questions in the chat box. I'm going to type in the location of where this webinar will be, the recording of this webinar will appear. I will put that in. But there are a number of questions.
Okay. I see one question. Any possibility that organophosphates will ever come back? In terms of residential uses around the home and garden, it's not very likely. They did risk assessments finding that it was the risk was too great for residential exposure, and new research has been coming out even more over time since the cancellation about potentially problematic effects, especially with exposure to children. So that's not likely to happen. What else? Would a barrier work for squash vine borers? If so, when would I put it on to ensure good pollination? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. It's going to be specific to your local area because things ripen and pollinate at different times of the year. So that's a great question for a master gardener in your area. Let's see. What's another question I can address?
There's one about broad-spectrum insecticides and the effect on beneficials.
Mm.
Do you see that one?
The leaf example, to explain that a little bit further?
I guess that's what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, with predators, I made the argument that predators can actually be impacted greater than pests when they're hit with a broad-spectrum insecticide. And the reason is, first of all, there are fewer of them to begin with because there's going to be fewer predators than there are pests based on the ecology. And the few remaining survivors, if there are any, may not have access to enough adequate food source because most of the pests are gone to sustain their lives. And then they have a slower time coming back in terms of population because we have to wait long enough for a couple of population cycles to go through to get that predator population back up. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. What's another question we can address? I see an answer in the box for the squash vine borers. Someone is recommending to plant according to your planting dates. You'll be finished with squash by the time they arrive. Okay. Exclusion's not a good idea there. Okay. Any others that I can address?
That's what I was.
Well, they are looking for more questions. We have a few questions that we'd like to ask you with our poll system. So if Suzanne has a chance to post our poll questions for us, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we appreciate y'all responding to these questions. Like I said, that helps us to know how to continue doing these webinars to make it beneficial to you. We're running low on time, but we just, like I said, this is appreciate everybody's patience during the little time when we had a little bit of audio issues, but we appreciate Kaci especially. She did a tremendous job covering the information and sharing with us.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored by 90-some people showing up for the webinar, and I hope those folks can actually pass it around to others, and we can prevent some mishaps.
Oh yeah, that's very important. There's a lot of times that happens. There was a number of I think you were over 100 at one time, so we had some great participation.
That's great.
Again, we appreciate our Danielle Carroll. She's a regional extension agent with Alabama Cooperative Extension System, and Kathy Flanders, an entomologist with Alabama Cooperative Extension System, helping us, as well as Amanda.
Okay.
Pest predator. See that one?
I think I tried to respond to that one earlier with the re-explanation. But if that person wants to contact me directly, I'd be happy to talk about it further. That's a good reminder there from Utah Extension. If you need help identifying a pest, contact your local extension office.
Right. That's what we're here for.
That's great.
We're here to provide research-based information.
Mm-hmm.
And oh yeah, somebody was asking about bed bugs. And I see where Kathy responded that there is a recording we did last year on dealing with bed bugs. It's a pretty difficult pest to handle.
Yeah, it sure is. And we talk to a lot of folks. About 1 in 20 calls these days is about bed bugs here at our center. You know,
one thing I learned this time is you need to get a positive identification, because there's a bat bug that there's infestation of bats, and it looks very similar to the bed bug.
Oh.
And our had sent it off, let our entomologist identify it, and it turned out to be a bat bug. It doesn't feed on humans, so that's why it's important to get a positive identification on an insect pest before you start administering some type of treatment. So these people were going to be spending a lot of money, and it turned out it wasn't a bed bug.
And it can be so much money to hire a professional for bed bugs that it can be pretty expensive. So that's a great reminder.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Kathy, you still there?
I'm still here, Charles.
Yeah. How long do we go on a little longer, or what? I didn't know if we had a cutoff.
I think you decide.
Oh, okay. You see any more questions there that you think she needs to respond to?
Oh, someone asked about printing slides from the presentation. You're welcome to send me an email, and I'll just send you the PowerPoint presentation so you can print them off in handout style or any style you'd like. I'm honored that you'd like them. So my email address was on a previous slide, so you can pop right back to it when the recording is up. Do you know, Charles, when the recording will be live?
Can I jump in and say that it should be up by Monday at noontime? There's a little bit of a lag before we can get at the URL, but as soon as we can get it, we'll post it.
Okay, great.
We again, we appreciate all the sponsors that sponsored the webinar. The E-Extension Communities of Practice supported fire ants, Urban IPM, Pesticide Environmental Stewardship and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, as well as University of Georgia Center for Urban Agriculture. So I guess we probably just wrap it up now. So looks like it's slowing down on some of the questions coming in. So we appreciate y'all joining us. Remember to help us out and complete the survey at the conclusion of the last slide there. Just click on that link and it'll carry you to it. So thank you again, Kaci, for presenting, and did a tremendous job, and appreciate everybody joining us for this program.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to everyone in attendance.